The email arrived at 6:47 on a Wednesday morning in the third week of November. Marcus Webb read it standing at his kitchen counter, still in his coat, a cup of coffee going cold on the marble beside him. The email was from Sandra Osai, his firm's financial controller, and it was 6 lines long. She was not a woman who used 6 lines when 2 would do. The fact that she had written 6 told him, before he had processed a single word of the content, that something was seriously wrong. He read it once, he set his phone face down on the counter. He picked up the coffee, found it had gone cold, put it back. He picked up his phone and read it again. The discrepancy Sandra had written was $430,000. Transferred across 14 separate transactions over a period of 23 weeks. Each transfer had been coded under the heading External Consultancy, and each had been authorized with the signatory access code assigned to the firm's acting managing director during the period in question. The acting managing director for the past 6 months had been his wife. Marcus stood in his kitchen for a long time. Outside, the city was beginning its morning. He could hear the distant percussion of a construction site. Ironic, he would think later, though he did not think it then. He was too busy absorbing the particular quality of silence that fills a room when something you had refused to see finally becomes visible. He reached into the breast pocket of his coat and closed his fingers around a small object. It was a notebook, black, cloth-bound, the size of a paperback, a Leuchtturm 1917 that he had carried in some form or another for 20 years. The current one was 2 years old and 3/4 full. On its first page, in his own handwriting, were the first working sketches of a mixed-use development he had been building quietly, carefully, and entirely in secret for the past 8 years. The development was called the Thornberry. It was valued at $78 million. Marcus Webb owned 70% of it. Claudia did not know that. Her mother did not know that. Her brother Fletcher, who had been calling Marcus a craftsman for the better part of a decade with the specific inflection that distinguished a craftsman from a businessman, did not know that. They were all about to find out. Here is what the Harrington family, Claudia, her mother Diana, and her brother Fletcher, believed to be true about Marcus Webb as of that November morning. They believed he was a competent architect of the quiet variety, that he ran a mid-sized firm called Webb and Associates with 13 staff, a respectable client list, and revenue of approximately $4.5 million a year. That he was diligent, methodical, and, by their collective assessment, somewhat limited in ambition. That he was, in Diana Harrington's precise formulation, a craftsman rather than a businessman, a man who was very good at the thing he did but fundamentally unsuited to the larger game. That the 6 months Claudia had spent running his firm had been an act of charity, a temporary intervention by a woman with an MBA and genuine commercial instinct into a company that had been coasting on its founder's technical reputation for too long. They believed that Marcus had spent those same 6 months occupied with a planning application for a development project somewhere in the city's eastern quarter, something to do with a disused textile warehouse, something vague and probably underfunded that would come to nothing, as these things usually did for men like him. None of that was accurate. Webb and Associates was not the primary vehicle for Marcus's wealth. It was the public face of it, the respectable, visible operation that explained his professional existence to people who asked questions at dinner parties. His real asset was Ashford Capital, a development consortium he had co-founded 8 years ago with 2 university colleagues, which had spent those 8 years quietly assembling land, planning permissions, and institutional financing for the Thornberry. A $78 million mixed-use development of commercial, residential, and cultural space that was now 6 weeks from completion. Marcus owned 70% of Ashford Capital. His share of the Thornberry's returns on current projections was $12.4 million. He had told Claudia when she asked about the Eastern Quarter project that it was a planning exercise, a speculative piece of work that might lead somewhere. He had been saying this in various forms for 3 years. He had said it not because he was secretive by nature, but because, somewhere around the 2nd year of their marriage, he had begun to understand that Claudia's interest in his work was not curiosity but accounting. And a man does not share the combination to his safe with a person he suspects is standing outside the door. The $430,000 had confirmed the suspicion. Now Marcus had a decision to make about what to do with the truth he had been keeping, and the truth she apparently had not. But before we go back to the beginning, before we trace the decisions that led Marcus to that kitchen counter on a November morning, I'd love to know where in the world you're joining us from today. Genuinely, these stories travel further than I ever expect, and knowing you're out there, wherever you are, makes every word worth writing. Drop your city or your country in the comments below. It takes 5 seconds and it means the world. And if you find yourself in this story, if you've ever trusted someone completely and later wondered whether that trust was returned, please consider hitting the like button and subscribing to the channel. There are many more stories like this one, and I want you to be here for them. Now, let's go back 6 years to the evening Marcus met Claudia Harrington and to the version of the future he believed he was building. He had met her at an industry conference in the second week of September 6 years ago. It was an urban development summit, 2 days of panels and networking in a conference center that had been designed, Marcus noted privately, by someone who had read about architecture but never quite felt it. Low ceilings, fluorescent light, a lobby that told you exactly how much the organizers thought of the people attending. Claudia was on a panel about commercial investment in regeneration projects. She spoke with the clean, unhurried confidence of a person who had prepared thoroughly and trusted the preparation. She had been a consultant at a mid-tier strategy firm for 6 years, with an MBA from a school whose name opened doors, and she spoke about capital deployment and risk architecture in a way that Marcus, who spent his working life thinking about actual architecture, found genuinely interesting. He introduced himself during the break. She raised an eyebrow at his firm's name and said she had seen one of his buildings, a community library on the north side of the city, which had won a regional award 2 years earlier. She said it was the only building she had walked into that week that felt like it had been designed for the people using it rather than the people paying for it. He had not said anything particularly intelligent in response. But she had laughed, and the laugh was real, and that had been enough. They married 3 years later. It was not a simple courtship. Claudia was direct about what she wanted from life in the way that people are when they have spent years watching others not get it. She wanted a partnership. She wanted someone who was building something, not someone who had already built it and stopped. She wanted, she said once, the feeling of being in motion. Marcus understood that. He was in motion. He had been since he was 24 when he had drawn his first building on a napkin in a cafe and understood, with the clarity that only arrives once or twice in a working life, exactly what he was for. For the first 2 years of the marriage, Claudia's energy was an asset. She had instincts about presentation, about positioning, about the way a firm communicated itself to the market that Marcus genuinely lacked. She redesigned the website. She restructured the client onboarding process. She attended 2 pitches with Marcus, and her presence changed the room in ways that were visible and measurable. The firm grew 15% in year 1 and 12% in year 2. Marcus was grateful. He was also, if he was honest with himself, beginning to notice something that he would spend the next 2 years choosing not to examine too closely. The gratitude Claudia expressed for his work, for the buildings, for the awards, for the reputation that underwrote everything they both benefited from, had a quality that was more administrative than warm. She spoke about the firm's projects in the language of portfolio management rather than craft. She referred to the library that had introduced them as a legacy asset. She told her family at a Christmas dinner that Marcus was very good at what he did, which is the sentence you use about a person when you have decided that what they do is a category rather than a calling. He noticed it. He told himself it was the difference in their professional backgrounds. She had been trained to see value in columns and rows, and that was not a flaw but a lens. He told himself the warmth was there in different ways, in different moments. He was not wrong about this, but he was not entirely right either. The Thornberry idea had come to him 4 years into the marriage, 2 years before the conversation about handing Claudia the firm's operations. It had come the way the best ideas came, not as a plan but as a question. He was walking a derelict site in the city's eastern quarter with an old university friend, Thomas Crane, who had moved from architecture into property law. Thomas had said quietly as they stood in the rubble of a 19th-century textile warehouse, "Someone is going to do something significant with this." Marcus had looked at the site for a long time. Then he had taken the notebook from his breast pocket and drawn the first line. He had not told Claudia, not then and not in the years that followed. He had told himself it was because the project was too speculative, too early, too uncertain to raise as a shared investment. He was not sure even now that he had been entirely honest with himself about the reason. Sandra Osa had been the firm's financial controller for 9 years. She was 47, methodical, and possessed of a particular professional integrity that expressed itself not in loud pronouncements, but in the quiet, sustained attention she gave to numbers that did not add up. She had found discrepancies before, always small, always explainable, always resolved with a document and an apology. She had never found one like this. She had flagged the first anomalous transfer in September, 2 months into Claudia's tenure as acting managing director. It was a payment of $18,500 to a company called Helios Advisory Group, coded under external consultancy. Sandra had raised it in her weekly summary, and Claudia had responded within an hour, with a brief email explaining that Helios was a business development consultancy engaged to help the firm expand its commercial client base. The retainer was a 6-month arrangement. Sandra had noted the response and moved on. The second payment came 3 weeks later, $24,000, then a third, $31,500. Then, and this was the number that had made Sandra stop entirely, a fourth, $47,000 in a single transfer on a Friday afternoon, authorized at 4:53 p.m., 40 minutes before the close of business. Sandra had pulled the original engagement letter for Helios Advisory Group. There was no letter. There was a 1-page service agreement, signed by Claudia with no accompanying scope of work, no deliverables schedule, and no evidence of any business development output in the firm's files. The company registration number listed on the agreement resolved to a sole trader entity incorporated 8 months earlier. The registered director of Helios Advisory Group was a man named Ryan Delaney. Sandra knew that name. She had heard it twice in the office. Once when Claudia had taken a call that she had walked away from Marcus's old desk to conduct in the corridor, and once when Marcus had mentioned, offhandedly, that Claudia had worked with a Delaney at her MBA program years before. Sandra had sat with this for 4 days before she sent the email. Marcus had sat with the email for 72 hours before he called her. In those 72 hours, he did not confront Claudia. He did not change his behavior at home. He made dinner on the Thursday evening as he always did on Thursdays. He asked about her day. He listened to her answer. She told him she had been in a meeting with a client from the commercial sector, a positive conversation promising pipeline. She seemed pleased. She poured herself a glass of wine and told him that the firm was in better shape than it had been a year ago. He said, "That's good to hear." He took his notebook from his breast pocket and set it on the corner of the kitchen table where it always sat in the evenings. Claudia glanced at it as she sometimes did, with the expression she had never quite learned to conceal, a faint impatience, the look of a person observing a habit they found unnecessary. The notebook contained, among other things, a detailed breakdown of Ashford Capital's financial structure, his 70%, Thomas's 20%, the remaining 10% split among 3 institutional investors who had come in at the 4th year. The Thornberrys projected returns, conservatively modeled, $12.4 million to Marcus upon completion. Completion was now 6 weeks away. He had drawn the cover of the notebook himself, a small, precise elevation of the Thornberrys' facade in pencil 3 years ago when the design had finally resolved. Claudia had never asked what the drawing was. On the Saturday morning, he called Sandra and asked her to prepare a complete forensic summary of every transaction to Helios Advisory Group for the duration of Claudia's tenure. He asked for it in writing, dated with all supporting documentation. On the Monday, he called Thomas Crane. Thomas listened without interrupting. When Marcus finished, there was a silence of perhaps 10 seconds. Then Thomas said, "When do you want to move?" Marcus looked at the notebook on his desk. "There is a building," he said, "that is 6 weeks from completion. I want to wait until the night of the completion reception." Another pause. Thomas, who had been Marcus's friend for 22 years and who had walked that derelict site with him 8 years ago, understood immediately. "All right," he said, "I'll get the papers ready." The arrangement had been Claudia's idea and he had agreed to it in good faith. She had put the case clearly. Marcus was overextended. The firm needed strategic leadership while he was focused on the Eastern Quarter project. She had the commercial background, the time, and, she said, the genuine desire to contribute to something they had built together. He had thought about it for 2 weeks. He had agreed. The first sign that the dynamic had shifted in ways he had not anticipated came 6 weeks into the arrangement, at a family dinner at Diana Harrington's house. These dinners happened monthly and followed a rhythm that Marcus had learned over 6 years. Diana cooked something that required complimenting. Fletcher held court about his work in private equity, and Claudia performed the role of successful daughter for an audience of 1. On this occasion, Claudia had asked to present what she called a strategic review of the firm's first 6 weeks under her direction. She had brought a printed deck, 12 pages, spiral-bound, with the firm's logo on the cover and subheadings that Marcus had not written. The deck described several changes she had made to the firm's operational structure: a new client tier system, a revised billing schedule, the engagement of a business development consultancy unnamed in the deck to expand the firm's commercial client base, and a reallocation of office space that Marcus noted with some care had involved the moving of his desk from the partner's office to a smaller room overlooking the car park. He had not known about the desk. He asked about it mildly at the table. Claudia smiled the smile she used when she was about to say something reasonable-sounding that was not open to discussion. The partner's office needed to function as a meeting room for client calls, she explained. He could use it when he was in the building, of course, it just couldn't be his exclusively anymore. Diana said, "That sounds very sensible, darling." Fletcher said, "You need the space, mate. The firm's growing up," Marcus said. "Yes, you're probably right." He put his fork down and looked at the deck. He was not looking at the reallocation of office space. He was looking at the line item for the business development consultancy and thinking about a company called Helios Advisory Group, and about a man named Ryan Delaney, and about the fact that the first payment to that company had been made 3 weeks before this dinner. He picked his fork back up and ate his food. He came into the office on a Tuesday in the 7th week. He still came in twice a week by agreement to review technical work, to find that the reallocation of his space had been more comprehensive than described. His drawing board, the one he had used for 20 years and which was the single piece of furniture he had transferred from his first studio to every office since, had been moved to a storage room. The client-facing wall of the main studio had been repainted in a color Claudia described as confident stone, which was an off-white that Marcus recognized as the kind of color chosen by someone who thought architecture was about surfaces. His technical drawings, the ones pinned to the board and the wall around it, the preliminary sketches for 3 active projects, had been filed. Claudia had left a note explaining that the studio needed to present as a clean, contemporary environment for client visits. He found his drawings in a flat file in the storage room, misfiled under a project from 4 years ago. Fletcher was in the office that day. He occasionally stopped by, as a function of the ease with which he moved through spaces that were not his. He looked at Marcus standing in the storage room with the flat file and said, "Upgrade, isn't it? The place looks like somewhere people actually want to come." Marcus looked at him for a moment. Then he said, "Where are the pins from the drawing board?" Fletcher looked briefly confused, as though the question had come from a different conversation. "No idea, mate. Try the top drawer in the kitchen." Marcus found 4 of them. He put them in his pocket. He spent the rest of the morning in the smaller office, redrawing from memory the sections of the sketch that had not been scanned before the drawings were filed. He did not say anything to Claudia that day about the board or the drawings. He noted in the notebook the date and what had happened. He noted it in the same section where he had been noting other things: the precise dates and amounts of the Helios payments, the client calls he had returned to find rerouted, the staff member who had pulled him aside one Tuesday to ask, with the careful diplomacy of a person protecting their job, whether the changes to the billing process were permanent. The notebook was becoming a ledger. He heard it on a Friday evening at Diana's house in the hall outside the sitting room. He had arrived early. Diana had asked him to pick up wine from a shop near the Harrington house, and he had come straight from the shop rather than waiting for Claudia, who was coming from a client meeting. He had let himself in with the key he had been given 3 years ago, set the wine on the kitchen counter, and was moving towards the sitting room when he heard Diana's voice through the half-open door. The voice had the particular unguarded quality it only took on when Diana believed she was speaking without an audience. She was talking to Claudia. "What you need to understand," Diana was saying, "is that Marcus is very good at what he does. And what he does has a ceiling." She paused, and Marcus heard the sound of a glass being set down. "He's not a businessman, he's a craftsman. There's a difference. A craftsman makes things beautifully. A businessman makes things grow. You have always been the second kind. That firm will be in a different position in 3 years if you're running it than it would be in 10 with him at the wheel." He heard Claudia say something he couldn't make out. Then Diana again. "I'm not criticizing him, I'm saying that the 2 of you have different gears. His gear is fine for what it is. Your gear is faster. That's not a judgment, it's an observation." Then Claudia clearly, "I know, Mum." Marcus stood in the hall with the front door still faintly ajar behind him. He stood very still. He was not surprised. The sentiment was not new, only the nakedness of it. What was new was the word craftsman delivered in that tone in that room by a woman who had never built a single thing. He thought of the notebook in his breast pocket. he thought of the Thornbury. He thought of a site he had stood on 8 years ago with Thomas Crane in the rubble of a Victorian warehouse and the line he had drawn that evening. He was not a craftsman, he was an architect. The difference was the kind that only becomes visible once the building is standing. He pushed the door open and said, "Sorry I'm late. Traffic was worse than I expected." Diana smiled and said, "Not at all, darling. The wine looks lovely." The fourth scene was the last before Sandra's email arrived, and it was the most precise. It was a charity gala in late October, a fundraiser for an urban renewal organization that Marcus had supported quietly for years, without publicity, and for which he had designed a community center at cost 8 years before the Thornbury was even a sketch. It was the kind of event he attended without fanfare. He sat at a table, he wrote a check, he went home. Claudia had brought Fletcher. This happened occasionally. Fletcher knew several of the property developers in the room, and Claudia had been cultivating those relationships for the firm's commercial pipeline. During the dinner, a man named Charles Whitmore, who ran a development fund and who had been trying to get a meeting with Marcus for 2 months about a potential project commission, introduced himself to the table. He had admired the community center. He had heard about Webb and Associates' recent work. He wanted to know more about the firm's current direction. Before Marcus could answer, Claudia spoke. She spoke for 3.5 minutes by Marcus's count. She described the firm's new commercial strategy, the client tier system, the revised positioning, the business development work underway. She described the leadership changes she had implemented. She used the word leadership. She used the phrase fresh direction. She referred to the firm's founder in the third person once as the technical lead. Charles Whitmore listened politely, nodded, asked 1 or 2 questions, and moved on. Fletcher, when Whitmore had gone, turned to Marcus and said, "See, that's the stuff you need. Claudia gets the room. That's what the firm's been missing, someone who can actually sell it." Marcus had a glass of water in his hand. He took a sip. He set it down. He had been the technical lead on the community center that Charles Whitmore had traveled across the city to admire. He had designed it in 3 weeks during the most difficult year of his professional life. It had won 2 national awards and had been described by one critic as the most generous piece of architecture built in this city in a generation. He was the firm. He said nothing. Fletcher took his silence as agreement and began talking about something else. Marcus reached into his jacket and touched the notebook's cover. Under his thumb, he could feel the small pencil elevation of the Thornbury that he had drawn on the front. The building that would, in 6 weeks, render every calculation in this room, every assessment of his ceiling, his gear, his limited instinct, so thoroughly obsolete that it would be almost funny. Almost. On the Saturday after the gala, Marcus sat in his study from 7 in the morning until past midnight. The study was the one room in the house that was entirely his. Claudia had repainted everything else in the 2 years since they had bought the house: clean colors, a considered palette, surfaces that photographed well. The study she had left alone, not out of deference, but because its disorder was too deep to address without removing him from it entirely. The walls were covered in drawings, some pinned, some taped, some fixed with the leftover drafting dots he had kept since university. There were structural sketches and site photographs and material samples. There were pages torn from notebooks and annotated with the dense, abbreviated script that meant nothing to anyone who hadn't learned to read it over 20 years. And at the center of the wall, directly above the desk, the focal point of the whole room, was a large format print of the Thornbury's final elevation, printed at half scale, with the construction phasing overlaid in red and the completion timeline marked along the bottom. The timeline now showed 6 weeks remaining. Marcus opened the notebook to the section he had headed Ashford Capital, a section of roughly 30 pages that contained 8 years of the project's development, from the first sketch on a derelict site to the financial models that now ran to 47 pages in a separate bound document locked in his desk drawer. He pulled out the bound document and opened it to the summary page. Webb, 70% equity stake in Ashford Capital Limited. Crane, 20% equity stake. Institutional investors, 10% combined. Projected net return to Webb upon completion and initial commercial occupancy, $12,400,000. Conservative projection based on current tenancy agreements and debt settlement schedule. He read the number in the way he had read it many times, not with elation because the number had never been the point, but with a specific satisfaction that was architectural in nature. The satisfaction of a load-bearing calculation that had resolved exactly as it should. He had made the right decisions in the right sequence over the right amount of time. The building stood because the foundations had been right. He turned to the notebook's current pages, the section he had been writing in since Sandra's email. He reviewed the Helios payments in sequence: $18,500 on the 14th of June, $24,000 on the 4th of July, $31,500 on the 28th of July, $47,000 on the 11th of August. Then 9 further transfers of amounts between $22,000 and $39,000 across the following 8 weeks. Total $430,000, 14 transactions, 23 weeks. He wrote the total at the bottom of the list and circled it. Then he wrote beneath the circle, "He's not a businessman, he's a craftsman, there's a difference." He left the sentence there on the page, he would need it later. Thomas Crane had known Marcus since their second year of architecture school, where they had sat next to each other in a structures lecture and argued about load distribution in a way that had gone on for 3 hours longer than the lecture itself. Thomas had moved from architecture into property law 15 years ago, not from disillusionment with buildings, but from a recognition that the legal architecture of development was where the most interesting problems lived. He was the reason Ashford Capital existed as an entity rather than a sketch on a napkin. He was also, at this point, the only person outside the consortium who knew both things: the full scope of the Thornbury and the full scope of what Sandra had found. They met at Thomas's office on the Monday after Marcus's Saturday in the study. Thomas had spent the weekend reviewing Sandra's forensic summary, which Marcus had forwarded, and had come to the same conclusion Sandra had. "It's fraud," Thomas said without preamble. He said it without visible emotion, in the way that lawyers say things that would sound dramatic coming from anyone else. 14 unauthorized transfers to a company with no documented scope of work, no deliverables, and a registered director with a prior professional relationship to the signatory. "She didn't even try to make it look clean," Marcus said. "I think she believed there was nothing to look for." Thomas looked at him. "That might be the worst part of it," he said. "They worked through the mechanics for 2 hours." Thomas had prepared a draft civil claim for fraudulent misappropriation, which could proceed alongside a police referral or independently of it. Sandra's documentation was thorough enough to survive any court scrutiny. The signatory records were digital and time-stamped and could not be altered. There was also the question, Thomas said carefully, of Ryan Delaney. Whether Claudia's relationship with him was purely transactional or something more was not Marcus's to establish. That was for the police if it came to it. But the fact of the company, the payments, and the absence of any legitimate business record was evidence enough for the civil claim regardless. Marcus nodded. Thomas said, "I want to say something to you as a friend rather than a lawyer." Marcus waited. "You could have handled this differently. You've known about this for 3 weeks and you haven't said a word to her. Most people couldn't do that. The fact that you can tells me something about how long you've been carrying this weight in general." Marcus looked at the notebook on the table between them. "I've been carrying a building," he said. "The rest of this is just paperwork." Thomas was quiet for a moment. Then, "The Thornbury invitation list, you want them there?" "I want them in the room," Marcus said. "The Thornbury is a public building. It's going to be in this city for 100 years. I want the first night to be accurate about who built it and who didn't." Thomas picked up his pen. "Right," he said. "Then let's talk about the invitations." Sandra, when Marcus called her that evening, said 3 things in sequence. She said, "I've finished the full documentation." She said, "I'm sorry you're having to do this." And then, after a pause, she said, "You know the firm is going to be fine. It was fine before she arrived, and it will be fine after. The people in that building come to work because of you, not because of a strategic review." He thanked her. He did not tell her about the Thornbury, but he told her that the reception was in 6 weeks and that he wanted her there at the front of the room because she had earned it. The invitations to the Thornbury's completion reception were sent on a Thursday, 4 weeks before the event. They were printed on card stock the color of pale concrete, the same material that formed the building's ground floor facade, with the Ashford Capital name embossed in the upper left corner and the building's elevation printed in pale gray across the lower half. They were not ostentatious. They were, Marcus had specified, the kind of invitation that communicated significance without announcing it. Claudia's invitation was addressed to her directly at their home address. She was listed as a guest of Webb & Associates, the firm she had been running for the past 6 months. 3 further invitations were sent to the Harrington address, one to Diana, one to Fletcher, and one to a cousin of Claudia's who worked in property journalism, and whose attendance Marcus had specifically requested, for reasons that Thomas had found professionally inadvisable and personally understandable. All four were described as guests of the principal developer of the Ashford Capital Consortium. Claudia received her invitation on the Friday morning. She came into the kitchen holding it with the expression of someone processing a pleasant surprise. "Did you know about this?" she asked Marcus, who was eating toast. "I knew there was a completion reception," he said. "I thought it would be nice for the family to come." She looked at the card again. The principal developer. She turned it over as if there might be more information on the back. "Who is the principal developer?" she asked. "I'll explain everything on the night," he said. He stood up, rinsed his plate, and picked up the notebook from the counter. He said, "I think it's going to be a good evening." He said it with the specific tone of a man who means something precise by a sentence that appears to mean nothing much. Claudia looked at him. He was already moving towards the door. Meanwhile, Thomas had filed the police referral, a formal report of suspected fraudulent misappropriation, with Sandra's forensic documentation attached. The referral had been acknowledged and assigned to a financial crimes unit. Marcus had been told it was likely to result in a formal interview invitation within 4 to 6 weeks. He had noted this timing with a grim sense of symmetry. Sandra had prepared 3 printed copies of the forensic summary, bound in the same format as the Thornberry planning documents, and locked them in the firm's safe. The evening was set. All that remained was to arrive in it. The Thornberry stood on the corner of 2 streets in the city's eastern quarter, and it was, Marcus thought, as he walked towards it on the evening of the reception, exactly what it had always been in the notebook. Honest, not showy, not the kind of building that demanded your attention from a distance. The kind that earned it when you arrived, that made you slow down, that gave you the unmistakable sensation of being in the presence of something made with full attention. The facade was board-formed concrete and reclaimed brick, warm under the December lights. The ground floor was fully glazed, so the interior activity was visible from the street. The catering staff moving through the space, the guests beginning to arrive, the light catching the double-height atrium ceiling that had taken Marcus 11 months of structural argument with the engineers to achieve. He stood on the pavement for 90 seconds. He did this with every building, arrived on foot from a distance and let himself see it as a stranger would. Then he went in. The Harringtons arrived at 7:20. Marcus saw them from across the atrium, Claudia first, in a dark dress, then Diana in the charcoal coat she wore to events she considered significant, then Fletcher with the expression of a person who has decided in advance that they are going to be impressive at a party. Behind them was the cousin, Meredith, who wrote for a property publication and who had the watchful alertness of someone always looking for the angle. Fletcher's reaction to the atrium was the most visible. He stopped just inside the entrance and looked up. The ceiling was 12 meters at its apex, with a structural timber grid that filtered the light in a way that was impossible to photograph accurately and had to be experienced directly. Fletcher looked up at it with the expression of a man recalibrating. Then he looked around at the guests, the architects, the planners, the council representatives, the institutional investors, the journalists. He said to no one in particular, "This is a serious room." Diana was more composed, but Marcus, watching from the far side of the atrium, could see the adjustment happening behind her eyes. She had come expecting a firm's launch party. She was standing in something else entirely. Claudia was looking at the building. She was not performing for her family. She was not networking. She was standing in the middle of the Thornberry's atrium, looking at the ceiling, and something in her face had gone very still. Marcus watched her and thought of the evening he had first sketched the building's outline in the notebook, at the kitchen table while she read on the sofa beside him. She had glanced up once and said, "Another planning sketch?" He had said yes. She had gone back to her book. He allowed them 20 minutes to move through the reception. He watched Fletcher attach himself to a group of property developers and announce that his brother-in-law was involved in the project somehow. He watched Diana accept a glass of champagne and ask a member of the catering staff whose building it was. He watched Claudia stand at the glazed ground floor frontage and look out at the street. At 8:20, Thomas appeared at Marcus's shoulder. "Ready?" he said. Marcus set down his water glass. He had not touched the champagne. "Yes," he said. The building's events manager called the room to attention at 8:25. She thanked the assembled guests, architects, planners, investors, journalists, council representatives, and the development consortium's team, and said she was pleased to introduce the principal developer and founding architect of the Thornberry and the Ashford Capital Consortium. She said Marcus Webb. There was a pause of perhaps 3 seconds. In those 3 seconds, Marcus watched the Harrington family's faces. Fletcher's glass stopped halfway to his mouth. Diana's expression performed a brief, involuntary recalculation. Claudia went very still. Marcus walked to the front of the room. He had a microphone, but he kept his voice at the register he used for client presentations, clear, unhurried, calibrated to a space rather than broadcast across it. He thanked the structural engineers, he thanked the planning team, he thanked Thomas. He said something brief and genuine about the building's history, the site, the warehouse, the neighborhood. He said that the goal from the beginning had been to build something that belonged to the city rather than the other way around. He paused. He reached into his jacket and took out the notebook. "This has been in my pocket for 8 years," he said. "Since the first evening I stood on this site." He held it up briefly, small, black, cloth-bound. "If you work in this field, you probably have something like it." He opened it to the first page and looked at it for a moment. Then he looked up. "I want to say something about what this building represents beyond the architecture," he said, "because I think there's a lesson in how it was built that matters more than the building itself." He looked at the room. 70% of this building, 70% of this development, this consortium, these returns, belongs to a man who was described 6 months ago by people who are in this room tonight as a craftsman rather than a businessman. A man with a ceiling, a man in the wrong gear. No one moved. "I want to be precise," he continued. "Those exact words, 'he's not a businessman, he's a craftsman, there's a difference,' were spoken in a private conversation. I heard them because I arrived early to a family dinner and no one knew I was in the hall." He looked at Diana. Diana had gone the particular color of a person who has heard their private words spoken in a public room. He reached into his jacket again and took out a single folded document. He unfolded it and placed it on the table beside him, the consolidated ownership summary from the Ashford Capital Articles of Association, printed on headed paper with the figures clearly visible. Fletcher, from across the room, craned to see it. The Thornberry will generate, on its conservative return projection, $12.4 million to the principal developer. He looked at the document, then back at the room. "I'm the principal developer." He paused. "I have been the principal developer for 8 years. During the 4 years when I was being told in various ways that my firm needed a different gear, that I was good at what I did but fundamentally unsuited to the larger game, I was simultaneously building one of the most significant mixed-use developments this city has commissioned in the past 20 years. He paused again. "I would like to propose that the ceiling was not where anyone thought it was." There was a sound in the room that was not quite applause, more a release of tension, the collective exhale of 200 people who had just understood the full shape of something. Marcus did not smile. He said, "There is one more thing I need to address, and I apologize to most of you that it needs to be said here. But it is part of the same story and it deserves to be spoken in the same room." He looked at Claudia. She was standing at the edge of the group near her mother, and her face had settled into an expression that was not anger or defiance but something that looked, from the distance of the room, like the expression of a person who already knows what is coming and has understood in the last 15 minutes that there is no version of this evening where it does not arrive. 6 months ago, Marcus said, I agreed to step back from the day-to-day management of my firm, Webb & Associates, and hand operating control to my wife. I did this in good faith. I believed it would be beneficial for both the firm and for our partnership. He picked up Sandra's bound summary from the table beside him. Thomas had placed it there quietly at the start of the evening. During the 6 months of that arrangement, $430,000 was transferred from the firm's operating accounts to a company called Helios Advisory Group. The transfers were authorized by the acting managing director. There is no engagement letter with a scope of work. There are no deliverables. There is no documented business development output attributable to the consultancy. Sandra Osei, the firm's financial controller, documented each transaction in a forensic summary that is now in the possession of both my legal team and the Metropolitan Police Financial Crimes Unit. He set the summary on the table. The registered director of Helios Advisory Group is Ryan Delaney. He said the name without emphasis in the same tone in which he had said every other sentence. The room was absolutely silent. Claudia's face had changed. The composed anticipation was gone. What was left was rawer and smaller, a version of her face that Marcus had not seen before, that was young and frightened and stripped of the architecture of her usual manner. Fletcher had put his glass down. Diana was holding very still. Marcus looked at his wife. Claudia, he said, I'm not going to speak to you about this here. Thomas has documents for you with the full civil claim and a letter from the police unit. Your family knows because you made decisions about my firm and my money in front of your family, and they need to understand the consequence of that. He paused. "I'm sorry this is happening in public. I didn't know how else to make it accurate." He closed the notebook. He said to the room, "Thank you for being here. The Thornberry is open. Please enjoy the building." He stepped away from the microphone. He did not look back at the Harrington family. He did not need to. He had said what needed to be said in the room where it needed to be said, and the building he had spent 8 years making was standing around all of them, 47 meters of honest work, and it was not going anywhere. The weeks that followed had the quality Marcus associated with the period after a building is handed over to its occupants. The intense, concentrated effort was over, and what remained was the slower, quieter work of watching what endured. Claudia was interviewed by the Financial Crimes Unit twice in December. Thomas's civil claim was served on the 3rd of January. The police investigation moved with the methodical pace of financial crime cases. Slowly, but in one direction only. Ryan Delaney was interviewed in February. By March, Claudia had retained a criminal defense solicitor and had begun the process of liquidating assets to prepare for potential financial orders. She did not contest the civil claim. The $430,000 was repaid in full in 2 installments, the second in April. Marcus did not experience this as satisfaction. He experienced it as arithmetic. A number that had been taken had been returned. The accounts were balanced. The structural damage to the firm, which Sandra assessed as recoverable within 18 months, was being addressed. The criminal process would take longer. Marcus did not follow it closely. Thomas kept him informed at the intervals required by the civil process, and Marcus filed the information in the section of his notebook labeled administrative and did not return to it outside those conversations. For Fletcher, the consequences were of a different order, reputational rather than legal, but no less real in the world he occupied. The story of the Thornberry reception had moved through the property and development community within 48 hours. The story of the craftsman who turned out to own 70% of the most discussed development in the city, revealed at his own completion event in front of the family who had dismissed him. It was the kind of story that people retold because it was satisfying in structure, because it had the shape of a thing that had happened correctly. Fletcher had been in that room. He had been on record to multiple people as the brother-in-law who had suggested Marcus stick to drawing. Those people did not let the record expire quickly. A significant co-investment arrangement Fletcher had been pursuing with a commercial property fund was paused in January and ultimately withdrawn in March. The fund manager, when asked, cited a due diligence concern about associated reputational exposure. Fletcher did not call Marcus to discuss this. Marcus did not expect him to. Diana Harrington sat on the board of 2 charitable organizations in the city. By February, she had stepped down from both, citing a need to focus on a family matter. The city's charity community was small and had excellent memory. The phrase craftsman rather than businessman, exact, verbatim, attributed, had circulated in enough conversations that Diana's position on those boards had become, in the polite language of governance, untenable. She did not call Marcus either. Meredith, the cousin who worked in property journalism, published a profile of the Thornberry in February. It was factual, detailed, and generous in its treatment of the architecture. It mentioned in the 3rd paragraph that the principal developer had spent 8 years building the project while managing a separate architectural practice, and that the project had been unknown to his immediate family until its completion. She did not editorialize, she did not need to. The facts laid out in sequence were editorial enough. The letter arrived in the 3rd week of April. It was handwritten on plain notepaper in an envelope with no return address. Marcus recognized Claudia's handwriting immediately, the particular forward slope of it, the way she made her capital letters. He did not open it for 2 days. On the 3rd morning, he sat at his desk with the notebook open in front of him at a blank page and the letter in his hand, and he read it. It was 4 pages. She did not begin with an apology. She began with a question. She asked when, precisely, she had started to think of the firm as an opportunity rather than as something Marcus had built. She said she had been trying to answer this for months and could not arrive at a single moment, only a drift, a slow recalibration of values that had happened in the accumulated pressure of years of watching her mother calculate people's worth in one currency and one currency only. She wrote about Ryan Delaney. She was direct. The payments were wrong. They were wrong in conception and they were wrong in execution, and she had known this when she made the first one, not as an abstract ethical position, but as a physical sensation of crossing a line that she then spent the subsequent months refusing to acknowledge she had crossed. She wrote, "I told myself it was a consultancy arrangement that I intended to formalize. I knew when I wrote that sentence that it wasn't true." She wrote about the Thornberry. She said, "I knew you were working on something significant. I told myself I didn't need to know the details because I trusted that you would share them when the time was right. I understand now that you stopped trusting me before I stopped trusting you, and that you had better reasons for it than I ever recognized." She wrote about the atrium. She said, "When I walked into that building, I knew immediately. Not because of anything you said, you hadn't said anything yet, just the building itself. I recognized it. I had seen that quality of attention in your work for 12 years, and I had spent 2 of those years trying to root it into the firm's revenue model. I was standing in the proof that I had misunderstood the thing I married, and I was standing in it because you had built it for the city rather than for yourself, and I had never once done anything for anyone that wasn't eventually about me." The letter ended, "I don't expect forgiveness. I don't think I deserve it. But I needed you to know that the building told me the truth about both of us, and I am trying to build something with what I learned from that. I'm sorry, Marcus. Not for the money, though I am sorry for that too, for who I became without noticing." He read the letter twice. He folded it. He put it in the notebook in the section behind the Ashford Capital documents where it remained. He did not reply, but he did not destroy it. In May, Webb and Associates won a commission for a new civic archive building on the city's south side, one of the most significant public commissions of the decade. The commission had been influenced in part by the attention the firm had received in the wake of the Thornberry story. Marcus began the preliminary sketches on the Tuesday after the announcement, at his drawing board, which had been returned to its original position in the partner's office. Sandra had bought a new set of drafting pins and left them on the board without comment. On the last Friday of May, Marcus drove to the Thornberry at 6 in the morning, before the building's occupants arrived, and took the service lift to the roof terrace. The terrace was one of the building's 3 public spaces, open on weekday mornings, free to enter, designed with the specific intention that people should come and be in it without being required to do anything there. He had spent 11 months arguing for its existence and another 8 months arguing for its size. He stood at the northern edge and looked at the city. He had built this, not to prove anything to anyone. Not to demonstrate a ceiling that had no ceiling. Not to arrive at a completion event with a document and a verdict. He had built it because a derelict site in the Eastern Quarter had asked a question 8 years ago, and he was the kind of person who answered questions with buildings. The notebook was in his breast pocket. He opened it to the blank page after Claudia's letter and drew a single line. The first line of the Civic Archive. "There is a particular failure of imagination that belongs to people who have decided in advance what a person is capable of. They look at a quiet man and see a ceiling. They look at a craftsman and see a category. They mistake patience for limitation and stillness for defeat. They do not understand, cannot understand from the elevation of their certainty, that some people are not building towards the approval of the room they're currently standing in. Some people are building towards a room that doesn't exist yet." Marcus Webb built a building. He built it with full attention over 8 years without announcement. He made every structural decision from the ground up, and he carried the load of those decisions in a notebook in his breast pocket while the people around him told him what his ceiling was. They were standing inside the answer when they said it, and that is not a story about revenge. It is a story about what happens when you build on honest foundations and wait for the building to speak. Now, what do you think? Was Marcus right to wait until the Thornberry's completion before revealing the truth, both about his ownership and about the $430,000? Some people would say he should have confronted Claudia privately, without the audience. Others would say the public reveal was the only way to make the full truth visible to the family who had shaped Claudia's values as much as Claudia herself. I genuinely want to know where you land on that. Tell me in the comments, and let me know where in the world you're watching from. I read every single one. If this story stayed with you, if it said something true about trust or patience or the difference between a craftsman and a builder, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel. There are more stories like this one, and they're worth your time. Until next time, build on honest ground.